Hey everybody, Jimmy Kukulski here from Elite Lubrication Specialties, Diesel Pro, Red Fox Racing, and I forget all the stuff that I'm involved in right now, so busy. But anyway, I'm getting a lot of questions about race oils, additives, specifically zinc. Why do I need this? Why do I need that? Hey, I need a lot of zinc. I need a lot of magic potion stuff. And so if you've watched my other videos, my Tribo tips, you know that viscosity is the thing that keeps two parts separated. Pretty simple. There's no magic about that, really. Why then do we need anti-wear? That really matters as you differentiate the application. A gearbox with EPs and gears meshing and how that works versus a roller bearing, which there are a lot of roller element bearings in gearboxes, versus a journal bearing versus a roller lifter cam versus a flat lifter cam scenario versus a rocker and a push rod, or a rocker and the tip on the valve. All these things, okay, they technically, if in a perfect world, you would have a different viscosity oil for each one of them, or you'd have a different additive package for each one. So let's just take, for instance, most people know because they drive every day, an engine, okay? In an engine, you're gonna have typically, you'll have your main bearings, your rods, which will be smaller or bigger depending on the application. You'll have a gears or chain, okay? You're gonna have a pump. You're gonna have push rods, possibly. You're gonna have rockers and followers. You're gonna have, and then you're gonna have the point to point for the rockers to the valves. In a perfect world, every one of these applications would take a different oil. I mean, I would probably typically have a lower viscosity oil here and a much higher viscosity oil here. Now, I did it this way because technically, as we move this way along this line, and then we end to point, the viscosity should go up. And there's a reason for that. Your lowest load and highest velocity is on your mains and rods. Okay, so technically speaking, in a perfect world, your viscosity would be lowest at operating temperature in this area here, because your load is spread out on a main bearing much wider than it is on a rocker to valve tip. All right, so, and you have very high velocity. The highest velocities in your engine are going to be right in this area here with the pistons and the ring cylinder liners. Okay, so technically speaking, your viscosity will be lowest there. And then you get up into your gear, your chain. What happens in a cam? Okay, your cam runs at half the speed, typically, of the crank. You know, valves up. If you know enough about engines, you know that that's just kind of part of the deal. If you look at a small block Chevy or small block Ford, you take the front cover off, the crank gear is half the size of the cam gear. It's running at half the speed to be able to time the valves properly. I don't want to get too much into that, but it moves slower. So technically, if you had the same amount of load, you would have to increase viscosity for a cam or a gear. Let's say a pin or a gear, when it moves in there, is moving at a different speed, has a significantly different load than a main or a rod journal bearing does. Now we get up into the rockers, okay? Those are the roller on a lifter. There's a tremendous amount of load there for a very small contact patch. So your load over the surface area is very high. It's moving at a lower speed than your mains and rods. So technically that would need an even higher viscosity. And then we get into what we talked about with your rocker point. You've got a fraction of an inch contact between your rocker tip and your valve top. All right, and that has a tremendous amount of load for a very small area with almost very little velocity movement, right? It's basically just pushing and pull and letting off, push, let off. And so what that does is, I mean, there might be a small roller on it, but it's very slow, low velocity, very high load. And that you would need a really high viscosity oil for. But engines typically only take one viscosity oil or a multi-grade oil over a certain temperature range, right? So what do they do to combat this? They put in anti-wear. They put in chemicals, zinc, among other things, to be able to react with the pieces of metal where you would typically require a higher viscosity oil, but they lean for the vis in your rods and mains. They want this to be right because this is significantly more easier to deal with when it comes to viscosity and getting that right. It can cause us a lot of fluid friction if you go too high viscosity here, where all the rest of these won't affect efficiency if it's too low viscosity and they pump up the anti-wear, okay? So, technically speaking, you get the vis right here and you put anti-wear in for the rest of this. This is where race oils come into play, specifically here. You start increasing load in your mains and rods and you get out of spec of what the viscosity is for the load in that, you have to have anti-wear that acts very quickly from a brand new assembly perspective or a brand new testing, or you're out on the track, you're going from 0 to 100% duty cycle and temperature very quickly. The ad pack needs to activate very fast in a race application. On the road, you're all within OEM standards. You're all within OEM specs. So API and the engine manufacturers, everybody gets together and they have a happy dance where they design these ad packages that work very synergistically with each other. And then the OEM manufacturer says, we want this version of what they said, or we want that version of what they said, API says, or the oil manufacturer say. They play a lot better in the realm of API and on-the-road oil, CJ4, CK4, SI, all the on-road standards are much closer. The engine manufacturers are working with these people and figuring out the ad packs within, maybe the EPA standards or something like that. When you start getting into the racing application, you're playing, first of all, you're playing chemist. You're putting all kinds of weird chemicals and you're increasing heat, which is an accelerant, right? And you're changing loads and you're changing velocities on all these points at the same time. So you need something that's going to act a lot quicker. And typically in a racing application, you change the oil a lot more often because you have a lot more fuel contaminants and other things. You're more concerned about a race engine that costs as much as a house than you would be maybe your Ford Escape with a $6,000 long block. So you're pulling the oil out a lot faster. So the oil doesn't need certain things like detergents to deal with 7, 8, 10, 15,000 mile oil changes on the road when you're dealing with breathing in or out, lots of heat cycles where you're bringing water and ambient moisture in there. So there is two different areas of engine oil performance where you're talking about racing versus on the road. Now there's definitely an overlap in some of these where you can get not the best of both worlds. You give up a little bit in one area, you give up maybe the really fast acting ZDP, but you got some of it in there and you blend it with some of the detergents that you need, specifically like diesel engine oils. That exists, and there's some good companies out there that make that. But when somebody asks me about zinc, adding it, flat tappets, older engines, when you start talking about this chemistry experiment, this physics experiment that you're creating in your engine from a racing application, just keep in mind, this is what we're actually talking about from a scientific perspective, from a tribology perspective. We're trying to overcome the physics and the chemistry of the challenge inside the motor with more chemistry and more physics. All right. Hey, I love answering questions. I really want to bring the racing side of this into it because I have a lot of passion for it. So please shoot me a call, 616-460-9949, Jimmy at elslubrication.com, or look us up on Facebook, Diesel Pro Elite Lubrication Specialties. Have a good one.